reason why I wanted you to take a minute to articulate that is because I'm going to ask you for the next hour to set that aside. So that's the way, and recognize that that's the way that you usually plan, that you're used to that, and that we're going to try something different. And I just want you to bear with me and try to keep in mind, when you fall back into planning that way, try this new approach and know that all the stuff we just talked about is going to come into your unit later on. But we're going to start in a different place. And because really, what's the point of going to a 3-day workshop to plan a unit the way you've always planned the unit, right? So try something new. Know that it's going to be hard and it's going to be weird, and that we're also going to get to that stuff that you really care about. So for me, it's those novels, and I would have to say, okay, I'm going to put thinking about what novels I'm going to teach to the side, knowing that I get to pull those in later on, but that we are going to start, what we're doing this morning, we're going to start with just the standards. Okay? So this activity is something that that we've developed and kind of modified based on something that the Kentucky Writing Project, actually the Kentucky State Department of Education has something related to this, but had some weird things in it that didn't make as much sense, and so we kind of modified it to make it more logical and simplistic, I think. So the purpose of this is, first of all, to become more familiar with your content and grade-specific standards, because that's what you have in those cards that you printed off. And then to look at how the different strands, the reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language, and that's some language that's used around the Common Core. Those are referred to as strands. Those are the different strands. Now we have reading, writing, speaking, and listening strands for all grade levels and content areas, and then the language is particular or specific to elementary and secondary language arts. So they have 4 strands, while the other groups have 3. Also, language arts separates the reading into literature and informational text. So you'll see that once we start digging into the standards. And then our final and ultimate goal is to articulate goals for a unit plan that's aligned to these standards with a focus on argument. Okay? So here's the process. You'll be working in teams by grade level with 2 to 4 teachers per team. You can kind of negotiate that because it's helpful, I think, to go through with somebody who teaches something similar. And since this isn't about the content that you teach, it's only about the grade level standards, you can, at least for this first part of the process, work with people who don't even teach at the same school as you. And you'll start by, and don't do this yet, but you'll start by placing the cards in the table in rows by strand, which I've done up here, which you can't see, but that's, it looks like this if you have color-coded cards like I do for my 11th and 12th grade. But if not, then they're just white and you have the different strands laid out there. Okay, so you'll start by doing that. And then, so you've got them out by strands, and the first thing is to pick a card, and for our purposes, you're going to start with something that's related to argument, and that represents an important core goal for a unit. And the selection of that first standard is really important because you want to pick one that's really rich and complex, and that you think you could focus on as a central focus for a particular unit. So if you just pick some random card that isn't really that rich or complex, it's going to be hard to pick the other cards to group with it. So picking that first one is really important. And then you go through together and decide which standards most logically fit with that standard for an instructional unit, and pull the corresponding cards. And push yourself to try to pull from all the different strands so you can get at this integrated model of literacy. So you've got reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language for language arts teachers. And then I've given you a note catcher to record those standards. So you start just by pulling, and then there's a place on that to record the reading, and you can code them. Actually, the coding on here is by grade level and standard number. So if you don't want to have to write them out, you can just use those little codes once you've done. Write out your central standard. There's a place to do that, and then a place to just jot down the other standards. And then what you do is take those cards that you've pulled and written down and put them back in the mix, because we never want to set up a situation where the standards are just like a checklist and that you're done with those, right? Because that's not how instruction works. And so you put them back in because they might come up in another grouping of standards, because that's the way that students are going to try things again in different ways, in different contexts with different groupings of standards. So you put them back in and then try another grouping. And it's really important to try to get to that second grouping, because a lot of times, as we know, with your first draft of composing anything, the first first piece or whatever is not always the best. So you practiced it now, so try another one, beginning with a different standard that's related to argument, and then group again. You probably won't have time to do 4, but there is space on your note catcher for 4. and then you'll be choosing one of those groups to develop more over the next few days, or today and tomorrow, the next couple of days, okay? So I'm going to talk through this for one example. I'm doing 7th grade. I don't teach 7th grade, but I thought that would be a good place to kind of go sort of in the middle here. And this is a new grouping for me because I have never done one focused on argumentation. So I did practice this on my own, but I don't have notes here because I want to talk through what I'm thinking as I go through this. I will tell you that I picked my central standard, obviously, beforehand because I didn't want to spend a lot of time thinking here about which one was the most rich and complex standard, but that I did pick one that's related to argumentation. So, but I'll just, for example, I wouldn't want to pick probably, let's see, reading informational 7.1, which says cite several pieces of textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. I can't see that being a focus of a unit. And if I chose that one, I think I'd have a really hard time picking the next one because this doesn't seem that complex. It's definitely something that's going to come up in a grouping and probably a lot of groupings, but I wouldn't pick this one as my central standard. So I did pick reading informational standard 7.8. Okay, and then just again for the coding for people who don't know, that's how this is coded. RI is reading informational. If you don't teach language arts though, it's just reading for you because you don't have reading literature and reading informational. Grade 7, standard 8. Okay? So this standard right up here, trace and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, assessing whether the reasoning is sound and the evidence is relevant and sufficient to support claims. So that is related to argument, and I think that it is pretty rich and complex. That this idea of assessing and evaluating evidence and thinking about relevancy and sufficiency is something that I could build a unit around. So that's my first standard. So then what I'm going to do is look through the strands and just pull cards that seem to be related to this one that would make sense to group together in some final task for students or that as goals for a particular unit. And I am actually going to pull that reading informational 7.1 that has to do with citing evidence to support an analysis of what the text says as well as inferences drawn, because I'm going to want students to do that, right? If I'm evaluating the evidence that they use, I want them to pull some specific words and phrases as part of that and be able to cite them specifically. So then I'm looking through 7.2 has to do with central ideas in the text. I don't necessarily think that one's directly related to this one. The next one has to do with interactions between individuals, events, and ideas in a text, but that's more about what's going on in the text than the actual use of evidence in it, so I'm not going to pull that one. I'm just kind of moving down through this one. There's one about structure, there's one about point of view or purpose, and how the author distinguishes his or her position from that of others, and I think that might be an interesting standard to group with this one, looking at their overall purpose and then how the evidence fits into that. So I'm going to pull that one. Oh, and then reading informational text 7.9 has to do with looking at how two or more authors write about the same topic and how they present key information by emphasizing different evidence or advancing different interpretations of facts. So I'm going to pull that one because that seems very, I could look at comparing and contrasting what this looks like for two different writers and analyzing their use of evidence. So, which is kind of what we did yesterday with looking at multiple texts and analyzing that line of reasoning. So I'm going to pull that. It's pretty good. I've got 4 reading standards. There's no number that you have to pick. It's more about how they're related to one another, but you do want to make sure that it's relatively manageable. So I'm going to go with 4 reading standards and then move over to writing. So under writing, I've got writing arguments. Obviously this is a unit focused on argumentation, so for my writing piece, I definitely want to include that. But I'm actually also going to pull the writing informative and explanatory because I would see students doing that in preparation for writing their final argument. So looking at some articles and then explaining what's presented in those. So I'm going to pull that one too. And that's just also kind of to remind us that we don't have to have only one of those first 3 writing standards, and we don't have to compartmentalize those 3. So I'm going to pull that. I don't see the narrative fitting in here, so I'm going to skip over that one. And then writing number 7.8 has to do with gathering information from multiple print and digital sources. And so I think that that would be an interesting thing to look at, maybe how evidence is presented in visually, like we've done with some of the magazine covers, and maybe in some graphs or other type of visual sources or even videos. So I'm going to pull that writing standard 2. And then writing standard 9 has to do with drawing evidence from literary or informational texts. I'm actually going to pull that because it's so closely related to reading number 1. It asks you to cite specific evidence and then in your writing to use that evidence. So I'm going to pull that with the grouping too. Okay, and then I would move on to speaking and listening and figure out which of those standards I could pull that would be in service of this. And there's actually one here that has to do with delineating a speaker's argument and their claims and the relevancy and sufficiency of their evidence. So that one's related. They could be listening to something and then doing that same analysis. And then finally, the language standards. I always am going to try to pick one language standard. And here's the beauty of the language standards for language arts teachers. You know what I'm talking about. There are 6 at each grade level, and that's it. So it's very clear what we're focusing on as far as language instruction at each grade level, and those are really nicely scaffolded. So I could just pick one of those that would be interesting to have students think about in their writing for this one and focus on that really specifically throughout the teaching. So I would pull one of those. So then I have my grouping of standards and my related focus standards. That's what I pulled there. So this is an example of what it would look like. I don't actually know for sure if what I wrote up here is exactly what I just talked about because I just freestyled it for the second time, but it's probably pretty close. So this is my central standard here, and then these are the reading standards that I pulled, the writing, speaking and listening, and language, which only applies to language arts teachers. So I have one grouping right there. And what I want to do is put those back and then see if I can get through at least a second grouping of standards. Yeah?
So you started with a reading standard, your central standard. Do you always start with the reading? Can you start with the writing or speaking and listening?
You can start wherever you want. I model it usually with reading because I think we're going to jump to writing, and many of you might jump right to that argument writing standard, and you can try that and see how it goes, but it might actually be pretty hard because it basically says write arguments and back them up with evidence, and so it would be kind of hard then to maybe pull that second standard, but go for it. I mean, there's no right answer. The only thing I would say is do pick something that you would see as a central goal for a unit and then pull from there. And since you have time, maybe you try starting with the reading and then just starting with the writing, or starting with writing first, starting with speaking and listening. I've never modeled this starting with the speaking and listening, but I think that would be a really interesting way to do it. Yeah?
So this is just specifically for like my history one, like the writing standard 10.3. I mean, there's like 12 things on here. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that you have to fulfill within the lesson?
No.
Or do you focus on, okay, small d?
Yeah, you might. So for a lesson, you definitely wouldn't focus on all of those. And
okay.
For a unit, you may not focus on A through E. You may focus on just a few of them. And so for this, you could circle the ones that you want to focus on.
Okay.
You can tab them using sticky notes. So, but yeah, they are complex. I mean, that's what we're talking about. When Paula says you have to teach argument, you have to teach. We need to meet the standards, we need to teach the way that it's explained there and some of the reading standards that are attached, but not all in one unit necessarily by any means. And along those lines, I just want to say that I think once you start looking at these standards, I think that you'll see that they're complex, but also hopefully you see that the Common Core isn't necessarily as complex as many people are making it out to be. So this right here, this is my grouping of 11th to 12th grade standards. This is the Common Core state standards for a 12th grade teacher. And this is it. So there are all other conversations about reading, we can't read literature anymore, and we can't teach persuasion anymore, and there are all these conceptions. We can't front load reading for students. We can't model things for them, and all of those things outside of Common Core actually come from outside the Common Core. And this is what the standards actually are. And for our instructional purposes, I think that is refreshing, that when you lay those out on the table, you'll see that this really is what your responsibility is, and it's not necessarily any of the other myths and things that are out there. Okay, so so we're going to take some time. Let's see, let me look at the time, see how much time we have to do this now. So you're going to work in your groups, whoever, kind of talk at your table about somebody who would be logical for you to work with, 2, 3, or 4. Spread out. If you want to use some of these other tables, feel free to do that. set out a group of standards and your note catcher and just start, we'll move around, help out, answer questions.